Ni hao, my fellow reactionary counter-revolutionaries. On today's episode of Lavader bullying individuals with special needs, we are coming back to visit an old friend of the channel, everyone's favorite Iraqi doctor, Hakim. How's it going, old friend?
In popular media, the widely recognized narrative of the Tiananmen Square Massacre, all of the above is a lie. It never happened.
Jesus fucking Christ. Unfortunately for me, the white man is a curious being by nature, so I had to click and check it out, and this video left me feeling like a Russian peasant after Trotsky's annual mustard gas attack. Yeah, the arguments in here are definitely something to behold, as you will come to see. So I decided, okay, I guess I will be talking about the Tiananmen Square Massacre and debunking Hakim's video on it. If my memory serves me well, this is the very first video on my channel where I talk about China or really East Asia in general. Well, as people say, there is a first time for everything, and I guess you could say I'm happy that this is it. And you know, say what you want about China, but it is genuinely impressive how they managed to advance so rapidly in the world. I have no doubt that if society collapsed tomorrow, they would be able to rebuild pretty fast. But the question is, would you be able to? With the book from Hungry Minds, you can, the sponsor of today's video. The book, How to Rebuild Civilization, is your ultimate survival guide, packed with the essential knowledge to start the world all over again. Created by Hungry Minds, a team of scientists, artists, and thinkers from around the world, this isn't just a book, it's a tool for thinkers, doers, and dreamers. Over 400 pages of breathtaking illustrations, practical inventions, and timeless wisdom. From medieval machines to modern problem solving, every page blends ancient knowledge with future-forward ideas. Printed on high-quality Mati art paper with stunning handmade visuals, this almost feels more like a work of art rather than a book. Whether you're a history buff, science nerd, or someone who loves what-if questions, the book arms you with the skills and insights to face the unexpected. It's empowering, accessible, and beautifully designed. Perfect for your shelf or as a gift for the curious minds in your life. Ready to explore how to rebuild civilization? Tap or click the link in the description to grab your copy now and start your journey from scratch. Make sure to also follow the creators on Instagram at HungryMindsTheBook and turn the page on what you thought you knew. And a thank you to Hungry Minds for sponsoring this video.
The students keep asking, what should we do next? What can we accomplish? I feel so sad, because how can I tell them that what we are actually hoping for is bloodshed? For the moment when the government has no choice but to brazenly butcher the people. Only when the square is awash with blood will the people of China open their eyes. Only then will they really be united. But how can I explain any of this to my fellow students? And what is truly sad is that some students and some famous, well-connected people are working hard to help the government, to prevent it from taking such measures.
This is Liang, the self-declared supreme leader of the Tiananmen Square protests. We'll get back to her soon.
Literally the very start of the video and Hakim is already poisoning the well. I mean, it's not like I expected anything less. I have no idea why Hakim feels the need to bring up the fact that she called herself the supreme leader of the protests, but oh damn it, we all know why he included that bit, in an effort to immediately poison the well and make it seem like she represents the protests as a whole. I will say that there is some controversy in regards to the way she expressed these things, and it very well may have come down to a translation error. Now, she herself, in her autobiography, claims that she was misunderstood and that she was just trying to communicate that an inevitable crackdown was getting closer, and that the government response was decided long before. And also keep in mind that this was recorded as her last will and testament, meaning that she thought that she was going to die and that this was some kind of last message. What Hakim also doesn't mention is the fact that Chai Ling's statement outraged many other student protesters and leaders. This was far from some unanimous opinion everyone else held. One of the student leaders, Wu Renhua, clashed many times with Chai Ling, and he was far from being her ally, and his thoughts on that infamous video could be read in Louisa Lim's book, The People's Republic of Amnesia. For his part, Wu Renhua, who clashed repeatedly and publicly with Chai Ling back in 1989, attributed her words back then to an excess of emotion rather than any Machiavellian scheme to engineer a crackdown. Like her, he is wary of any re-evaluation of the students' actions. At this point, we should stand very clear, he told me, 100% it's the government's responsibility. How would it make it right for us to say maybe we are also responsible for a certain percentage of this result? To me, logically, this is so wrong. Morally, it's very wrong. We are discrediting those who died. We are dishonoring them. Was it, as Renhua claimed, just an excess of emotions? Was she misunderstood as she claimed? Or was she genuine about the things she was saying as Hakim claims? Maybe, maybe not. We do not know for sure. But even if we do assume that she did mean these things genuinely, it is still very slimely to put her at the very beginning of the video in order to poison the well, making it look like this was something all the students were on board with, despite the fact that she clashed numerous times with other student protest leaders, and that her statement caused a lot of outrage among them. This is a very common tactic in general which almost everyone engages in, highlighting the radicals and extremists within a certain movement or group, present them as some kind of representative, and then justify mass repressions against that group.
Okay, first some background. Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms in the late 70s shook up China's economy by introducing free market reforms, creating large gaps between the rich and poor, unsurprisingly, and bringing with it some very blatant forms of corruption. These reforms likewise scaled back welfare programs and relaxed price controls. This massively benefited Chinese farmers, of which there are a lot, and led to increased crop yields and spending by them, which, predictably in a market economy, caused inflation, mostly affecting urban dwellers. Students and urbanites expressed a certain sense of superiority, you could call it, over rural citizens, and were not happy to see peasants and farmers do better than them, even less so foreigners. Following cuts to tuition subsidies, students began protesting the presence of African exchange students. Like most foreign students, the Africans enjoyed greater standards of living in China, and some dated local women. Among the signs in the crowd at Heihai on Christmas Eve, 1988, were placards demanding greater democracy, alongside ones proclaiming "Death to the Black Devils." I don't think you've ever seen this in any of the commemorations.
Holy macaroni, Batman! A second case of poisoning the well before even getting into the main topic. Amazing, just fucking amazing. And this one is even worse because of the fact that this random piece of information has no relation whatsoever to the Tiananmen protests. This is literally just Hakim throwing this random info in there in order to demonize the protesters as le evil racists, so that when things go south, the viewer could go, I mean, you know, they were racist, so they kinda deserved it. And also, I checked out the article Hakim took that snippet from, called The Stain on China's Pro-Democracy Movement. And this article is hilarious in so many different ways. Actually, I think this is my favorite part. I will read it out to you. The movement's contradictions infuriated me. As strong as the lure of freedom and equality is, the widely held Chinese belief, shared by Japanese, Korean, and other Asian cultures, that the darker a person's skin, the lower his status and worth. That Chinese students at Tiananmen Square sang choruses of "We Shall Overcome" only underscored the dichotomy. Even the barrage of bullets fired at unarmed chanting figures in the early morning of June the 4th, 1989, though shocking and tragic, did not quit my concern at the awards dinner over the contradiction of racism and democracy. Yeah, people were literally gunned down and massacred for opposing their government, but they were not fond of black people, so, you know, I'm not that bummed out about it. Also, the movement's contradictions? What contradiction? Does this guy who wrote the article think that you can't be a racist while also believing in democracy? And not to mention the fact that we aren't talking about Western democracy if you want to go that far, but more or less a form of democracy tailored to the Chinese environment and history. Do I believe that a good number of Chinese students in Tiananmen were racist? Probably yes, but I do not see how their views on black people have any kind of impact on the whole situation they found themselves in.
The political discussion of the era was very complex and spanned the entire political spectrum, of course. That's not surprising, China is a massive country. The liberal narrative, though, centers on Hu Yaobang, a popular reform leader who at that point had been a key advocate for political liberalization within the Chinese government. His sudden death on April 15, 1989, sparked student protests, as many within that particular movement saw his demise as the end of a hope for Western-style liberal political reform. In the following days, the China Democratic Alliance, a US-based organization which wanted the outright establishment of capitalism in China, issued an open letter to Chinese university students, which was posted at many Beijing schools at the time, advising that the complete negation of the anti-liberalization movement of 1987 should be used as a breakthrough point. For those that can't read between the lines, this is a subtle call for regime change from a foreign government. How fun. Regardless, students of a particular class background began to gather in Tiananmen Square to mourn Hu Yaobang and voice their frustrations with the government. This subsection of protesters, which the Western press overwhelmingly focused on, demanded, on paper, Western-style democracy, government accountability, and civil liberties like freedom of the press and speech, largely inspired by Hu.
So, in regards to this, I have two questions. Number one, was the primary concern and ambition of the students to establish Western-style democracy in China, effectively changing the regime? And two, how much of an impact did the China Democratic Alliance have on the protests and how much they influenced the goals of the students? I mean, of course they wanted to utilize the unrest to their advantage, I don't think anyone denies that, but did they really have a big impact? So, let's see. Was democracy the main driving factor for the protesters? Well, it was one of the goals, you could say, but arguably the most important driving force for the protests was corruption and government accountability. According to Lim's book, these themes were stressed much more strongly in early campus manifestos than democracy. In a year when failed price reforms had led to runaway inflation of 28%, the students won support from bystanders who were angered by growing income disparities, official corruption, profiteering, and nepotism, themes that were stressed in the early campus manifestos sometimes even more strongly than democracy. Furthermore, the declaration for the student hunger strike explicitly listed concerns about corruption first among political causes for their action. Their declaration read, widespread illegal business dealings by corrupt officials, the dominance of abusive powers, the corruption of bureaucrats, the fleeing of a large number of good people to other countries, and the deterioration of law and order. Nothing much about democracy, really. Another interesting case is Paul Golden, who was an American student studying at Sichuan University and was present while the protests were ongoing. And from the things he heard and read at the university regarding the protests, this is what he said in an interview. One of the main things that sticks in my mind was that it was never a protest in favor of democracy. It was supposed to be a protest against corruption. Very, very late, after everybody had found out about the Chinese version of the Statue of Liberty that had been built in Beijing, at that point, people started using words like freedom and democracy. Now, does that mean that students didn't have democracy on their minds? No, of course not. While corruption was still their main concern, they were also in favor of democracy. And here is something Hakim fails to mention and emphasize. What democracy meant to the students varied tremendously from person to person, and student group to student group. Hakim tries to frame it that when the students talked about democracy, they meant Western liberal type of democracy. And while sure, there were definitely a few students that advocated for that, a good number of other students advocated for communist type of democracy, and for the party to return to its communist roots. A book detailing the protests, Who Will Shout If Not Us, also makes that important distinction in regards to democracy in China. The Chinese word for democracy is Minzhu. Min means the people, Zhu means to be in charge. Democracy is not a Western or contrary concept in Chinese communism. In theory, communism expresses the will of the people, and democracy is the means by which the people make known that will. But student demonstrators calling for democracy in the 1980s seemed to mean different things. Some meant that the government should reform and return to its communist roots, but others were clearly rejecting communism and equating democracy with a Western-style government. Jan de Wilde, who was then US Consul General in Chengdu, had this to say in regards to the protesters and their view on democracy. I don't think they had the foggiest idea what freedom and democracy actually meant in China or anywhere else. They were still very much operating in the framework of a one-party state. So yeah, students had differing perspectives on what they meant by democracy. And again, communists also advocate for a kind of democracy, just not the Western liberal kind. Trying to make it seem like the students wanted Western-style democracy because they advocated for democracy is just disingenuous. Other kinds of democracy also do exist, Hakim, not just the liberal one. And regarding that China Democratic Alliance point, again, I have no doubt that they wanted to leverage the unrest in their favor, but I have found no real evidence that they impacted the protests in any meaningful way besides sharing those open letters in the universities. And the fact that the students focused a lot more on corruption and government transparency compared to democracy, not to mention that not all of them sought Western-style democracy, kinda gives away the fact that the alliance did not really succeed in their goal.
In reality, their interests were different and their demands were different. These weren't representatives of the collective will of China, but instead a layer of the intelligentsia who wanted to be elevated and given more privileges, such as more political power and higher wages in their subsequent careers. When workers organized alongside them, students treated them with contempt. Despite their alliance on the square, educational and class differences continually hampered their relations. These students were not, after all, Laobaixing, meaning common people. They exhibited a wariness about the articulation of economic demands by other groups and wanted to keep the movement exclusively under their control. They would go on to cordon off their marches from those who weren't students or so-called intellectuals afterwards.
That is just an outright lie. Sure, the protests were mainly led and spearheaded by students and a few professors, but to say that they only wanted to advance their own pseudo-intelligentsia class and held disdain for ordinary people and workers is just a flat-out lie. There are numerous cases of the protests having elements of a sort of cross-class solidarity. You had workers and ordinary people protesting alongside them, but also providing them with aid like food, water, and sanitation. Actually, don't take it from me, take it from the infamous Tiananmen papers, secret Chinese government documents relating to the protests having been made available by an anonymous compiler within the government who goes by Zhang Liang. And in these documents it is stated, throughout the day, groups of demonstrators entered the square to support students. Often there were more than 100,000 people marching in support. They included workers waving trade union cards and ordinary citizens. There were also some staff members from government ministries and the Bank of China. Jeff Hay, in his book on the Tiananmen protests, offers numerous accounts of ordinary people helping the students and identifying strongly with them. Here are a few passages. One dynamic that the eyewitnesses say played a central role was the relationship between students and ordinary Beijing people. By late May, the common people were very impressed, if not a bit smitten with what they called our students. By the end of May, as the students tested their resolve through hunger strikes, workers and citizens were sending them water, offering help with sanitation and medical supplies, and giving general tender loving care. And this identification even extended to ordinary citizens retaliating and trying to defend the students when the PLA soldiers started moving towards Beijing to quell the protests. On June 3rd, as the army began approaching the square about midnight, calls went out all over Beijing. Sympathetic crowds numbering in the tens of thousands felt the army was coming to shoot the students. There are hundreds of accounts of citizens, mothers and sons alike, chasing tanks and bicycles, setting fire to trucks, putting up roadblocks. At the I'm not even gonna try pronouncing that overpass, a set of locals talked an entire truck full of soldiers into climbing down. By June, the ordinary people identified with the students 100%, Monroe remembers. Beijing people are outraged when the soldiers leave their barracks. They said the soldiers planned to kill our students, as they put it. Now okay, you might say, a lot of ordinary people identified with the students, but that doesn't mean that the students identified with them. Hakim even quotes that source that said the workers organized alongside them, but that the students were wary of them and their goals. Is it not plausible that the students just saw them as useful idiots to achieve their goal and gain some kind of legitimacy? And that would be a fair point if it wasn't for the Tiananmen papers obliterating that perspective by stating that the students not only accepted their help, but even urged workers to strike and join their cause. In Wuhan, large demonstrations that had been conducted daily since May 21st were having a serious impact on the life of the city. All 35 institutions of higher education were on strike. Students went to major factories to urge the workers to strike. They blocked the Yangtze River Bridge that links the three sections of the city. Railway and ferry transport for both passengers and freight was affected. In Chongqing, many more workers than before joined the demonstrations. In the city of Taiwan, students shifted their attention and focus towards incorporating both workers and soldiers, instead of it being just a student-led initiative. In Taiwan College, students began on May 20th to shift their attention away from protests at government offices and toward the formation of propaganda teams to work among workers and soldiers. On May 22nd, more than 1,000 students went to Taiwan Steel Company to distribute handouts and give speeches. Others went to military headquarters and army barracks to seek support from the troops. So in this case, who am I gonna believe more? A random pro-China news website or actual Chinese government documents stating that students were urging workers to strike and bring them into the fold of their movement, as well as soldiers in Taiwan? To me, that doesn't sound very, quoting that website, wanted to keep the movement exclusively under their control. Also on that point, Hakim brought up that they were trying to advance the interests and power of the intelligentsia with these protests. I don't exactly see how their demands were meant to empower the intelligentsia. Hakim, they didn't demand increased subsidies for universities, larger pay for professors or intellectuals. Is advocating against government corruption and striving for more transparency somehow gonna empower the intelligentsia more? I mean, come on. I know you Marxists are working off that historical materialism mindset, but this just doesn't make sense.
On May 27th, the Federation of College Students decided to represent their movement with a symbol, which was a plaster reconstruction of, I shit you not, the Statue of Liberty in Tiananmen Square. As if you needed any more information about where their ideological underpinnings lie. All this will become clear very soon.
Now children, I am gonna teach you how to use a powerful and easy tactic to shred most of the things said by Tankies, and this tactic is called the 5-second Google search. Alright, let's see. While many people have noted its resemblance to the Statue of Liberty, a sculptor present during its construction, Cao Qingyuan, has written that the students decided not to model their statue on the Statue of Liberty because they were concerned that it would be unoriginal and quote-unquote too openly pro-American. Cao further notes the influence on the statue of the work of Russian sculptor Vera Mukhina, associated with the school of revolutionary realism. Her piece, Worker and Kolkhoz Woman, was especially influential for their statue's head and facial features. And here we see the sculpture that inspired the Chinese goddess of democracy, a Soviet sculpture associated with a school of revolutionary realism. Do I have to say anything more? I think we can all recognize what Hakim is trying to do here by building up these things. He wants to portray the student protests as, one, inspired by Western liberal ideals seeking to enact a regime change and turn China into a Western-like capitalist country, and two, that their interests did not align at all with the general Chinese population and they just wanted to give more power to their class, the intelligentsia. With these 2 points, he could make the case that these protests were actually counter-revolutionary plots to overthrow the government, so the government is right in suppressing them. But, as I just showcased, Hakim's claims about the students and the protests are just falling flat on his face.
CIA cables gloated about how they wish this would anger the Chinese leadership, and in vague terms may have even ordered it. How about some more proof? Liu Xiaobo, a major protest leader who just 1 year prior called for the outright overthrow of the Chinese government, the institution of complete market reforms, and the replacement of Chinese culture with modern culture, read Western culture, that's what he meant, would arrive back in China from New York just in time for the protests, and would now call for armed struggle against the Chinese government. His reverse weeabooing for the West doesn't stop there, by the way. He's on record saying it would take 300 years of colonialism to transform China. In 100 years of colonialism, Hong Kong has changed to what we see today. With China being so big, of course it would require 300 years as a colony for it to be able to transform into how Hong Kong is today. I have my doubts as to whether 300 years would be enough. Yikes.
Wait, did he just call Xiaobo a major protest leader?
Liu Xiaobo, a major protest leader.
I don't know how to tell you this, Hakim, but Xiaobo was not involved in any way with the student protests at the beginning. He wasn't part of the writing of the manifestos and goals, and he wasn't involved in the organization of the protests. Rather, he was just some Chinese student living in America who flew back to Beijing to just join the protests. By the way, he only showed up late to the party when the protests were losing steam. And now he is being called a quote-unquote major protest leader? This alone is enough to just completely throw Hakim's point out of the window. He wasn't involved in the planning of the protests in the beginning, nor was he involved in writing the demands of the students. The equivalent of that one guy in a group project that just shows up at the very end and does a few little things while the majority of the work is done, and then says he contributed just as much as the other people in the group. In fact, he was such a big and important leader in the protests that when the movement was losing steam, he wanted to revitalize it and give it energy by organizing another hunger strike. And in total, 3 people joined him. 3 people out of tens of thousands. So much for being a major protest leader, Hakim?
Since the beginning of June, following 2 months of on and off protests, troops slowly made their way into Beijing. A number of these troops moved towards Tiananmen Square. The troops continued their negotiations and almost reached an agreement with the students that would have ended the protests. But this was sabotaged by the more radical, violent elements of those same liberal protest leaders looking for a fight, not a solution. On the morning of June 3rd, more attacks were made on military vehicles. Reporters for Time magazine stated, by 7 a.m. though, students and young workers outside Zhongnanhai were smashing their way into 2 military buses filled with light machine guns and crates of ammunition. As for isolated pockets of troops hemmed in at the intersections and overpasses around the city, the crowd was not in a mood to merely lecture them. In some places, the troops were stripped almost naked, chased or struck by angry citizens. Other injured troops had difficulty getting to hospitals as mobs deflated or slashed the tires of military ambulances. This isn't the least of it. I'm not going to show any of the footage, but the violence reached such a point that unarmed soldiers were burned alive. Some calculations have up to half the dead being PLA soldiers trapped in their armored personnel carriers, buses, and tanks as the vehicles were torched. Others were killed and brutally mutilated by protesters with various implements. These events that actually happened are instead overshadowed by mythical tanks running over people in tents, which never happened. Only after this did the government respond with violence in turn. The decision was made to bring in the troops which remained outside Beijing. At 6:30 on the night of June 3rd, the announcement was made around Beijing that people should remain in their neighborhoods and stay away from Tiananmen Square. Around midnight, soldiers stationed about 3 miles west of the square are said to have started firing indiscriminately at unarmed civilians in the streets. Chang'an Boulevard in particular became the scene of intense and brutal confrontations.
Okay, here we come to the juicy parts. I will first address what happened within the square itself. Hakim claims that there were negotiations between the military and students to leave the square, but that the student leaders sabotaged it because they wanted the violence to escalate. This is another lie. Yes, there were negotiations between the students and the army, and a lot of the students were upset when proposed with the choice to retreat, but, and here is the big but, the hunger strikers returned to the Heroes Monument with their news. Some students were angry that the 4 had talked to the military. They called Liu Xiaobo and the others traitors. But student leaders decided to take a vote on the next action. It was a close vote, but Feng Congde announced the result in favor of immediately vacating the square. They would all leave through the southeast corner. They all took a vote, and they agreed to leave and vacate the square. There was no escalation by the student leaders. They voted and accepted the results and started evacuating. And it didn't help the fact that the Chinese military only gave them 30 minutes to evacuate, and this was before they even took a vote. So within 30 minutes they had to vote, count the results, and then leave, which led to some forceful and accelerated withdrawal with the quote-unquote help of the Chinese military. But no, there was no escalation as Hakim claims. That is just outright false. The students did everything right here, despite the time frame given by the army. And as for the skirmishes, okay, so I will admit that before the troops entered Beijing and the square, there were some confrontations between students and security personnel, sometimes violent, but, and here is the absolute biggest but, they were not lethal. Notice how Hakim sneakily does not give a proper timeline of when those deaths occurred. People being burned in tanks and vehicles, or getting stripped and struck by angry citizens. He makes it seem like these occurred before the military knocked on the doors of the square, and that they were then justified in clearing them out. He makes it seem like the students were the ones who threw the first punch and killed security personnel first. This is outright wrong, and complete dishonesty on Hakim's part. I want to introduce you guys to Wu Renhua, a Chinese scholar and historian who specializes in the Tiananmen Square protests. He published 3 books in total on the events that took place, with a lot of research, and unfortunately, none of them are available in English. Those books have an extremely detailed account of the troops that were deployed to suppress the protests, from the units involved, their formations, orders, all brilliantly detailed work. And this is what he writes. In the June 4th incident, a total of 14 military and police personnel were killed, and none of them died before 1 a.m. on June 4th. In other words, they all died after the martial law troops began their bloody massacre. So, when did the army start using live ammunition against protesters and civilians? Wu states that the very first incident and the first recorded deaths occurred at around 10 p.m. on June 3rd. Around 10:10 p.m., tens of thousands of people formed a human wall at Beifenghua to block the troops. The two sides stood about 20 to 30 meters apart. Initially, the soldiers fired some machine guns and rifles into the air. Then, the front 2 rows of soldiers crouched, while those behind stood with their guns pointed out directly at the crowd. As the standoff continued and people threw stones, some troops opened fire into the crowd. Gunfire rang out, and tens of thousands of citizens began to retreat towards Mukshidi Bridge like a tide. This was around 10:30 p.m. Jeff Hay also backs that statement up in his book while giving a timeline of the events during the massacre. He also writes that the PLA started firing live ammunition into the crowd at around 10 p.m. This chronology he puts here is actually really useful if you want to understand what and where happened. So here is what we know. Not a single soldier or security personnel was killed before 1 a.m. on June 4th. The Chinese soldiers opened fire on the crowds at around 10 p.m. on June 3rd. So now try to put 2 and 2 together and tell me who threw the first punch and who was retaliating and defending themselves. Hakim explicitly states in the video,
only after this did the government respond with violence in turn. The decision was made to bring in the troops which remained outside Beijing. At 6:30 on the night of June 3rd, the announcement was made around Beijing that people should remain in their neighborhoods and stay away from Tiananmen Square.
Only after the killing of soldiers and the torching of vehicles did the government decide to bring in the troops on June 3rd. But how could this be possible if not a single soldier was killed before 1 a.m. on June 4th? And as for those torched vehicles with Chinese soldiers burning, while morbid, yeah, care to guess when that started happening? You guessed it, on June 4th, many hours after the army started using live ammunition against people. Now, if you remember previously when I quoted Jeff Hay on the citizens identifying with the students, he does note that the civilians started burning vehicles on June 3rd, but around or shortly before midnight as the army was moving in, so about 2 hours after the army opened fire. You could perhaps say that they started around midnight of June 3rd, but that the majority happened on June 4th. Nevertheless, This is why Hakim does not try to give a proper timeline, because what he is presenting is outright wrong. There were no soldiers killed or military vehicles burned until after the army opened fire. So unless Hakim can prove otherwise, that the protesters did throw the first lethal punch and that the army was simply retaliating, this little justification of his fails to hold any kind of water.
As for the square itself, a Taiwan-born singer and composer, Ho Dae-jun, who joined the student protesters at the square and negotiated with the Chinese army commissar, said, "During the whole withdrawal process, I didn't see a single student, other citizens, or soldiers killed in the square, nor did I see any armored troop carriers rolling over people." Richard Ross from CBS News reported being held by Chinese troops while driving through the square and didn't see any bodies or signs of a massacre. Additionally, James Miles, BBC's Beijing correspondent, said, "There was violence in Beijing, but no massacre in the square itself." Accounts from diplomats are very similar. A Chilean diplomat inside the square noted that while there were sporadic gunshots, most troops had non-lethal gear like batons and clubs. This particular diplomat's account supports the view that there was no mass shooting in the square itself. Even US embassy cables, later released, or unwillingly released by WikiLeaks, confirmed that the worst violence happened outside the square, especially at Mushidi, 3 miles west. These accounts from a diverse set of people and motivations challenges this widely held belief that there was a massacre within Tiananmen Square. The Chinese government always claimed no one was killed in the square, but they don't deny the serious violence and deaths that occurred in the surrounding areas. These reports from Western diplomats and journalists back that up.
So, if I understand the point right, the Tiananmen Square Massacre didn't happen because there was no mass slaughter within the square itself, just in the surrounding areas of Beijing. I honestly don't even know what to say here. Every time I believe they can stoop lower, they somehow just do. Do I really have to explain this? If I murdered my family in the garage, but the official police report states that I murdered them in the living room, I can't use that to acquit myself because it doesn't change the fact that I still murdered my family. Yes, I do concede, and I did do some digging. There was no massacre within the square itself. There was violence with the army clubbing and beating a few slow protesters while they were leaving the square, but no slaughter. But again, there was a massacre in the surrounding areas, including tanks and APCs running over people. I love how Hakim really thought he did something there by citing all these sources, thinking he owned dastardly libs, when this whole point of his is a definition of a nothing burger.
The Chinese government's account of the events was initially dismissed as propaganda, of course, but turned out to be more or less correct. They reported about 300 deaths, which is true, including many soldiers of the PLA. In contrast, Western sources seemed to decide at random what the death toll was. They claimed and still claim that thousands had died, ranging from 2,600 to as high as 10,000 people. Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times suggested, basically by guessing, that about a dozen soldiers and policemen were killed, along with 400 to 800 civilians. On the 12th of June 1989, the New York Times published an exhaustive but entirely fabricated eyewitness report describing brutal mass killings in the square. Eyewitness accounts and later investigations, though, revealed that the Chinese government's claims were basically correct.
I love how Hakim says things like, yeah, it was confirmed that the Chinese estimates were accurate, and then proceeds to just show no sources or evidence, just a simple trust me bro. But yes, unfortunately, we will never have a concrete 100% infallible number of the people killed during the protests. There are varying sources about the death toll, and I think we can all agree that the number given by the Chinese government is bullshit. But I personally gravitate more towards the initial number given by the Red Cross Society of China. They were there, boots on the ground during the whole event, and they most certainly kept up-to-date logs and records, and according to them, around 2,600 to 2,700 people had died, a figure also confirmed by the Swiss ambassador who visited the hospitals during that time. The Chinese Red Cross initially estimated that 2,600 people had died, a figure basically corroborated by the Swiss ambassador who had visited Beijing's hospitals and claimed 2,700 had died, but both quickly withdrew these figures under diplomatic pressure. Initially reported by the Chinese Red Cross and corroborated by the Swiss ambassador, but both mysteriously were forced to withdraw their statements under diplomatic pressure. That doesn't seem fishy at all. In any case, considering these two facts, I gravitate more towards the number given by the Red Cross, and again, conveniently Hakim avoids the topic of how many Chinese soldiers were killed. Wu stated previously when I cited him that 14 soldiers, security personnel, and police officers were killed during the protests. By the way, 7 of them having been killed at the hands of protesters because one convoy carrying 6 soldiers had accidentally drifted off of a bridge and into the water with them drowning, and a photographer of the military shot by his own comrades because they mistook him for a protester. So 7 soldiers were killed by the protesters. You would think that if the students were as bloodthirsty and violent as Hakim claimed, that the death toll would be, a lot higher.
Many of those killed by the army were in the western part of Beijing and on the way to the square, not in it. This may sound like a distinction without a difference, but it's not. Tiananmen Square is enclosed enough that the image conveyed by claiming there was a massacre in the square is one of shooting fish in a barrel, which is to say that it implies the soldiers were just blindly shooting into a restricted mass of people, which is horrific, but isn't what happened.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Something family killed in garage. Hakim says that this isn't a distinction without a difference, but fails at explaining why. Let me ask you, does it change the fact that hundreds, possibly thousands of people lost their lives? Does it change the fact that the Chinese army started firing on the protesters and civilians? Does it change the fact that people were getting squashed alive under tanks and APCs? The reason why the massacre became so widely known and ingrained into the minds of people is because of the fact that the Chinese military fired on their own people to squash a student protest, and as a result, people lost their lives. Does the location of the massacre change the fact that there were mothers and fathers weeping for their dead children? That the Chinese military will forever have the blood of their own citizens on their hands? No? Then there is nothing more to say here. The fact that Hakim thinks this is an actual argument and excuse is not even funny at this point. It's horrific and tragic. If he just pointed out normally that there wasn't a massacre within the square itself, but rather in the areas around it, then okay, fine. Yeah, I do agree that these things didn't happen in the square and that the media was wrong. But to go a step further and portray the protesters as some Western counter-revolutionaries with the intent of demonizing them and indirectly implying that it was sort of justified is a whole different story.
So what really happened that day? Well, for starters, this protest was not as spontaneous as it appeared. In the days leading up to the confrontation, the US government was actively involved in promoting the pro-democracy protests through a well-funded, internationally coordinated propaganda machine, much of which came from Voice of America. The protests were also not one ideological trend, but representative of a broad spectrum from working-class Maoists upset with Deng's reforms to liberal urban elites hoping that political reform would bring with it asset speculation and Western-like managerial salaries, and to hell with democracy if it suited them. Guess which section the Western press focused on. Wu Renhua, a leader of the protest, said it in even plainer terms. So, what do we want? Nike shoes, lots of free time to take our girlfriends to the bar, the freedom to discuss an issue with someone and get a little respect from society. Lofty ideals, clearly.
Amazing. Simply amazing. Hakim literally spent the first half of the video trying to portray the protests as being dominated and led by the student intelligentsia, wishing to overthrow the regime and bring about a Western liberal-style China, only now for him to backtrack a bit more and go, actually there were a few Maoists and hardcore communists there as well. It wasn't a centralized protest with one goal. Yeah, we can all smell what the hell you are trying to do here. So that whenever someone accuses you of painting the protest in this one stroke, you can pull the card that you said in a 3-second clip that there were also Maoists among them, despite spending half of the video convincing everyone that they were Western capitalist counter-revolutionaries. Well, I am not gonna fall for that trick. Also, regarding that Wu Renhua quote he pulled up, I am pretty sure I am not Tankie-brained enough to understand what is exactly wrong here. Is he implying that wanting Nike shoes, more free time to take girlfriends out to bars and able to discuss things freely is a sign of you being a liberal counter-revolutionary? I can't. I'm sorry, but I just can't. This man is committing 5 Tiananmen Squares simultaneously on my brain cells right now.
So again, while most people were there in good faith and looking for mild reforms, people like Chai Ling that you saw in the beginning of the video had ulterior motives. She admitted in an interview that the goal was to provoke the government into a violent crackdown with the hope that it would topple the Communist Party. Oddly similar to the desires of the US, I couldn't possibly understand why. She not only called for bloodshed, but thought that she herself was too important and that she should leave the square should any violence happen. How quaint. She's also on tape talking racist nonsense about how the Chinese aren't worth the effort. Additionally, reports from the time describe how these liberal anti-government fighters were highly organized and grouped themselves into formations of 100 to 150 people around the square, not inside it. They armed themselves with Molotov cocktails and iron clubs to use against the still unarmed PLA. Once the confrontations escalated, the deaths began, starting with dozens of soldiers and later protesters.
So, I actually checked out that article he is citing that students were organized into formations and were armed with Molotov cocktails. So it says that this is according to the Washington Post. So I went to the Washington Post article on Tiananmen, dated June 5th, titled Death in Tiananmen. And there wasn't a single mention of students organizing in formations, let alone wielding Molotov cocktails. So that was a fucking lie. But what the article does report is, oh, yikes. So you have a socialist news website writing an article titled Tiananmen, the massacre that wasn't, and arguing that the massacre didn't happen, citing an article that not only does not contain the thing they claimed, but also literally goes against their entire thesis and argument. You just can't make this stuff up, man. The mind of a Tankie is truly an enigma.
About foreign support. The movement received both financial and moral support from various international sources, particularly the United States. Newspapers and organizations in the US, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the UK were publishing false reports and providing outside financial support to the movement. Now, this wouldn't be a proper US-backed attempted coup or color revolution if we didn't talk about the Voice of America. Voice of America was pumping out propaganda at an incredible speed, increasing its Chinese language broadcasts to 11 hours daily, with the specific goal of creating confusion and panic not just among Chinese citizens, but soldiers as well.
US-backed coup or color revolution. I am this close to pulling my hair out. So, was the protest a US-backed counter-revolution, or was it a nuanced movement with different groups and demands? Which one is it? Take a damn side, Hakim. There is no evidence to suggest that the American government, provided any kind of financial support to the protests and students. What Hakim may be trying to refer to here are the international donations from private individuals. Chinese communities abroad and in Hong Kong gathered money to send to the students and support their cause. That much is true. But Hakim, there is a big difference between a government financially supporting something and tens of thousands of ordinary people out of their own pockets. But I guess to Tankies like him, there is no distinction there.
What we do know is that the inventor of the concept of American-backed color revolutions, Gene Sharp, was at Tiananmen Square during the protests. Sharp's co-worker, Colonel Robert Helvey, had also trained in Hong Kong the student leaders from Beijing in mass demonstration techniques, which they were to subsequently use in the Tiananmen Square incident of June 1989. He would later go on to train Falun Gong in China in similar civil disobedience techniques.
That article in regards to Gene Sharp's co-worker sounds interesting. He trained student leaders in Hong Kong in techniques to execute back at home. That could actually be some kind of valid point he is making. Let me go to the article he cites, which is this, The Myth of Tiananmen. So let me find that part he is citing by typing in the phrase down here, trained, and phrase not found. Yeah, I read the entire thing. This part he cites literally does not exist in the article. Now listen here, Hakim, you deceiving little I just can't go on anymore. I'm sorry. He spends the rest of the video bringing up other protests across the world and how the US supported them and no one bats an eye. But I think my job here is done. I believe I proved enough and debunked all the important points of Hakim's video. The Tiananmen Square Massacre did happen. It may not have occurred within the square itself, but very much around the area of it. The soldiers were the ones who engaged lethally first, and the students then proceeded to retaliate. They were not as bloodthirsty as Hakim makes them out to be, and that's not even mentioning the faulty sources and just outright false citations that don't even exist. I guess it makes sense now why Hakim does not provide the sources linked in the description. But yeah, my mind is gonna need a lot of time to recover from whatever the hell this video was, so I hope you enjoyed my suffering, and I will see you all next time.